right, it is 7 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before we do, did anyone have a question from the first class before we introduce any new material? If you missed the first class, it's on the YouTube channel. You might have to hunt a little bit for it because we produce so many videos every day that they kind of get a little bit buried. But it's there from last week. If you want to catch up, you just go to the homepage, tnlsf.org, and then in the very top left, there's a link to the YouTube channel where just about everything that we do ultimately gets recorded and archived. All right, so welcome to class 2 of 5 for Buddhism in a Nutshell. We meet after today, the next 3 Tuesdays at this time for 90 minutes. So last week was just the very first class, and we spent a good amount of time, kind of as I said last week, setting the stage, talking about the life of the Buddha and how he became known as the Buddha, the process of him showing the aspect of achieving enlightenment in Bodh Gaya under the Bodhi tree, and then his career after that as the Buddha, traveling around giving teachings to people, and those teachings became eventually written down. We talked about the Sanskrit canon, the Pali canon, where these sutras eventually were memorialized, and that is what Buddhism became, the practice of the teachings of the Buddha. So, and then we ended the last 20% of the first class. We talked about the four truths for the noble ones, the 4 things that the Arya beings know to be true, the 4 noble truths, but the 4 things that those who have a direct meditative realization of the nature of reality, the 4 things that they know to be true about the nature of that reality. We're going to pull back at the beginning of the second class. We won't immediately begin to go into more detail, specifically on the 4 noble truths. We're going to take a little bit of a step back and begin to look at the mind, the Buddhist model of the mind, because, as we know, that's what Buddhism is. Buddhism is a process of training the mind. So it's helpful to understand how the Buddha understands what the model of our mind is. So I will be using mind and consciousness interchangeably. In Buddhism, the 2 words don't have a different meaning. Mind or consciousness refer to the same thing. And you can see here on the screen that the definition of mind is that which is clear and knowing, or that which possesses clarity and awareness. That's the fundamental definition of what consciousness or what mind is. So we touched a little bit last week on how mind is a separate phenomena from the body. There's no bodily process or no bodily organ that is synonymous with the mind. We all know, of course, that there's a deep interrelationship between the brain, for example, and the mind, and we know, of course, even that the mind is connected to the body generally, because we know that, subjective awareness is one way of thinking of the mind, and we know that we become subjectively aware of physical sensations, that occur throughout the body: hot, cold, pain, rough, smooth, all kinds of physical sensations. So consciousness, therefore, must also pervade, the body in a general way, because the experiences of the body inform our subjective awareness, our subjective understanding. But at its most fundamental level, the mind is an energy that it can be characterized as clear and knowing. So clear in this sense refers to the mind's energetic nature, the fact that it is non-material. It doesn't have a particular shape or color or size or any sort of material definable characteristic or limitation. It also refers to and we'll get into this as we go along, but what they call, the word is in English adventitious, the adventitious nature of what they would call the defilement. There's kind of a number of sort of intense words, defilements or stains in the mind. These refer to problematic states of mind, like hatred, like maliciousness, like jealousy, ill will. These are states of mind that when we experience them, we ourselves suffer. When hatred arises in our own mind, necessarily we experience a painful mental state. And also when hatred arises in our mind, the actions that we're going to undertake on the basis of that, again, affliction is another word, the actions that we're most likely to undertake are not going to be beneficial to the person that we hate, right? If we experience hatred towards someone, we are going to respond to that person out of that intense negative state of mind, and we're likely to maybe physically harm them, try to mentally cause them harm. We're not going to act in a way that's beneficial. We're not going to act in a way that is in line with our goal for spiritual growth, spiritual development. We're going to act in a very detrimental, painful way. So we ourselves suffer when these states arise, and these are the states of mind that motivate us to harm those around us. If, for example, intense compassion arises in the mind, that's a very expansive state. That's a very pleasant state. The mind is at ease. The mind is spacious. And we're likely to engage in beneficial activities, pro-social activities when strong compassion is arising in the mind, because it's not similar to the afflictions, or delusions, the kleshas, different words that you'll come across. So that is another way of understanding this idea of the clear nature of the mind, right? Because at its most basic, the mind that we possess even right now, that mind is not one with the afflictions. It is not the same as the afflictions. The afflictions are for us present in our mind from time to time. They are arising in our mind. We are not free from the arising of affliction in our mind. But going back to that word adventitious, that means that the afflictions themselves are not in the same nature as the mind itself. They are obscuring this clear nature of the mind. So ultimately, when we get to a deeper understanding of the goals of Buddhist practice, what we can come to understand is that there's nothing wrong with our mind, that we don't have to make a new mind or a different mind or think, oh, well, that mind over there, that's a good mind. I don't have a good mind. I have a problematic mind, and I want to get a mind like this other person has. They have the right kind of mind. That's not the Buddhist view. We all have this mind, the mind that is at its core clarity and awareness. It is also true that for us, we haven't progressed beyond the arising of these afflictions, but we can. And when we do, this clear and knowing nature of the mind will be able to be manifest without the arising of those afflicted states of mind. But it isn't because the stains themselves are not the same nature of the mind. They're fully removable. They're fully removable is the best word maybe, from the mind itself. And then we uncover the mind itself, and the mind itself is the mind that we want to be in touch with. That is this clear knowing awareness is what we want to uncover through practice. And then knowing means that when the mind is directed toward something towards some object of awareness, it will generate some sort of internal representation of that object. When we see something, with our eye consciousness, we internally can say, oh, this was the color, this was the shape, this was, it was pleasant, it was unpleasant. It was a picture of this person. We generate an internal representation that we can hold in the mind, beyond being in contact directly with the object. So an internal representation of objects of awareness are generated when we put the mind or direct the mind toward objects of awareness. So there then are 6 divisions of mind or consciousness. So we have the 5 bodily sense consciousnesses, right? And then we have the mental sense consciousness. And it is kind of important to look at this scientific understanding of the mind, because for us, everything kind of gets jumbled together. Things are arising, different mental events are happening in close proximity to one another. And that makes it a real challenge to have a very clear understanding of what's actually happening. We misunderstand where these mental events are arising, and we misappropriate some aspects of what's happening in the mind. And that will become a little bit more clear. So the 5 bodily sense consciousnesses, they are just apprehending sort of raw sensory data. So they would say that the eye consciousness is only able to cognize shape and color. The ear consciousness is only able to, it's hard to say. I mean, we would say that they're sound waves, hitting the eardrum. Those are getting interpreted as different tones, different modulations of sound. But the ear consciousness itself isn't perceiving speech, for example, or isn't able to label this is speech, or this is song, or this is pleasant sound, or this is unpleasant sound. Similarly, the eye consciousness isn't able to apprehend a piece of art and say, I enjoy this piece of art, or or this is ugly, this is not pleasant to my mind. Those judgments about sensory data are happening in the mental sense consciousness. In the same way with our taste consciousness, the tongue consciousness or the gustatory sense is not labeling, pleasant food, unpleasant food. It is just maybe giving us salty, sweet, bitter, sour, savory, that sort of thing. And it's the mental sense consciousness that's following along behind that sensory data. And that is where we're labeling pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, or we're giving context to the sensory data. This face belongs to this name. That's happening in the mental sense consciousness, which is immediately preceding this raw sensory data. So the mind then is a river of mental events. It is a series of discrete cognitions, which depend upon one or more of the six consciousnesses together with their respective objects, right? So the eye consciousness is cognizing visual forms. The ear consciousness is cognizing sound. The physical tactile sense is cognizing, things that you can touch, hot, cold, rough, smooth, pain, etc., pressure. So there are respective objects. Buddhism doesn't really, there is sort of a, what this is presenting is kind of how things generally work when everything is working kind of normally. Of course, there are examples of what they would call synesthesia, which can be drug-induced, sometimes can be something kind of crossed or, wrong in the brain. So that happens, and Buddhism doesn't really talk about that sort of thing so much. Here they're talking about kind of the average process of cognition and how things work when everything is kind of operating normally. Of course, you can alter that with different kind of edge cases. So you have, and of course the mental sense power or consciousness is where you have emotion, where you have memory, where you have planning, where you have judgment, where you have like context for data. So that's all happening only in the mental sense consciousness. So if it's an emotion, there might be a sensation in the body that accompanies the emotion because body and mind are connected, but the emotion is arising principally in the mind. And then because body and mind are connected, there might be effects, of course, in the body as well. So that's what the consciousness is. It is this beginningless and endless continuity of these discrete mental events, moments where we are cognizing objects of awareness through one or more of the six sensory consciousnesses with their respective objects. So here, of course, beginningless and endless, these are assertions that you find in Buddhism. We talked about a little bit in the first class about how body and mind are separate continua. The mind existed before the arising of this body in the womb, and the mind will exist when this form falls apart, when this form, quote unquote, dies, ceases to be able to function as a host for consciousness. So the Buddhist assertion is that mind is always cognizing, always becoming aware of things outside of it, and that this process is beginningless and endless. We talked about last week, how there's door number 1 and door number 2. Door number 1 is just this process of mind associating with ordinary form, and then that ordinary form abiding for a lifetime, then that lifetime running out, that form being unable through the death process to continue hosting that consciousness separating from that form, and then that consciousness associating with another form. And how that door number 1, because all of those forms are ordinary forms, and because that mind is like our mind, a mind that has not yet separated from affliction, delusion, these kind of intense, heavy words that mean these states of mind like hatred and so on, then the experiences that are open to an ordinary sentient being are not ideal, right? The range of possible experiences are characterized by unsatisfactory conditions. But then door number two are what we looked at, when we talked about the Four Noble Truths. There's the true cessations, right? You can train in true cessations, and you can achieve either individual enlightenment or full enlightenment, individual, lower nirvana, higher nirvana, however you want to phrase it. You can follow one of these two paths taught by the Buddha, and no longer then is the mind subject to the arising of these afflicted states, and then no longer is the mind getting connected again and again with forms that are characterized by unsatisfactory conditions. And that is just preferable, right? Nature, our body, our mind is just an aspect of nature. It just is. And the Buddha, through training, discovered that enlightenment, whether it's individual or full, are things that nature permits. It permits the training that results in that accomplishment, and it permits not training in the result, in what results in that accomplishment. And the Buddha just said, hey, I've done this, and I feel like this is better, like I'm having a better time. I don't suffer anymore, and I'm able to really help. I'm able to, because I've done this, I'm able to really benefit others so that they also can experience this, that they also aren't going to suffer as well. So, it's really up to us whether we follow that path of training or not. But that is something that we can do. And if we do it, then all of the drawbacks that are associated with that process of birth and death, the cycle of what they call samsara, all of those drawbacks are eliminated for us. And then also we become able to use that state in a way that's really helpful for others, to help them also follow in those footsteps. Okay, so that's a little bit of an overview of the Buddhist understanding of the nature of the mind. I'll pause. Are there any thoughts or questions or concerns or disagreements? All of which are welcome. Nope. Okay, so we'll switch gears and we'll talk about a different topic. The topic that we're going to go into is what it means to be a Buddhist. And this is going to look at different aspects. The first aspect is what they call the Four Seals. So the word seal here is getting at the idea of, like, for example, a royal seal, like on a letter from a king or queen or whomever. They literally, like the wax seal on a royal communication, right? They would have a signet ring and they would pour wax. They would write a letter, they would pour wax, and then they would press their ring into the wax, and they would seal that communication. And because only that person had that signet, only that royal person had that signet ring, you would know that whatever the contents of that letter were validly from that person, right? You would be able to say, okay, I'm going to break this seal on this envelope, and I know that it must have been sealed by that person who was in possession of that ring. So the four seals are four aspects of or 4 ways of validating anything, any kind of philosophy, in order to determine whether it's validly a Buddhist philosophy. Just like if you look and you see the signet ring, well, that's validly a communication from this person. If we analyze any particular philosophical teaching, and if it accords with these 4 seals, then we can say, yes, this is actually something that the Buddha taught. If it's different than these 4 seals, if it violates these 4 seals in some way, then we would say, well, it must belong to a different philosophical system, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong, with a different philosophical system, but it's a way for us to be able to judge whether something that we're being taught is actually a Buddhist teaching or not. And if someone says it's a Buddhist teaching and we're like, well, it seems like it doesn't accord with one of the 4 seals, then we really should investigate. We should really try to figure out, am I misunderstanding something? Do they misunderstand something? It's a way of checking, what we're hearing. So the first seal is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. All compounded phenomena are impermanent. So a compounded phenomena is anything that exists as a product, which means it's composed of other things. So essentially, anything that we look at in our physical world is a compounded phenomena because it has different atoms, different molecules, different minerals, different substances that have come together to create whatever it is, whether it's a dog or a cat or an inanimate object. It's composed of things. It has parts. There's some of this and some of that have come together, and this phenomenon has arisen in dependence upon the coming together of different things. And so basically everything that we see then, or that we can taste or touch or listen to, can be described as being impermanent. So impermanent means that it is changing moment by moment by moment. So anything that we observe in our world, if we can pick it up, if we can see it, if we can taste it or touch it or move it around, if it has any materiality to it, then we would say that the continuity of that phenomenon is necessarily changing moment by moment by moment by moment, that there are no 2 moments in the continuity of that phenomenon that are identical, that are the same. It doesn't mean that continuity necessarily will cease at some point in the future. That's a common side effect of impermanence, but it's not part of the definition of impermanence. So for example, the mind is a compounded phenomenon, and it's changing moment by moment by moment, but it will not cease, because as we looked at, the mind is beginningless and endless. So the mind has no natural end point. It has no point at which it simply ceases. Although it is impermanent, it is changing moment by moment by moment, because we are always seeing something we have never seen before, or we're seeing it again, which means we're deepening some habit, some tendency. The mind is always changing, in dependence upon what it's cognizing, what is in front of it, what it's experiencing. And those experiences never stop. So the impermanence of the mind never stops. But the mind itself, but we would say that like a cat is both impermanent and temporary, right? There will come a point where that cat dies. And then we wouldn't say, well, this is this cat, Bob, right? We would say, well, this is Bob's body, right? This used to be Bob, but now we would call it, a body of Bob. And then later we would say, well, these are just the skeleton of Bob, right? Because it's going to decompose even further. And then in 500 years, we would just be left with some dust, right? And we'd say, well, and if someone has a record of it, you would say, well, this used to be 500 years ago, this was what's left of Bob's body. But we wouldn't say this is Bob the cat, right, at that point, because that phenomenon requires body and mind to be together, and body and mind have separated. So that phenomenon of that specific cat has ceased, because it basically, in order for something to be what it is, it has to perform the function that it performs. And when that phenomenon can no longer perform its function, we would say that it has ceased. But the mind always is capable of performing the function of being clear and knowing, or having clarity and awareness. That function never dissipates from the mind. So the mind is impermanent but eternal, but it is true that most things are impermanent and temporary, because they will cease to perform their function at some point in the future, whether they break or whether they die, or depending on whether they're animate or inanimate, they will cease to do what it is that they do at some point, except for primarily the mind is an exception to that rule. Okay, so we'll do one more seal and then I'll pause again for questions. So the second seal: all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. So this one's again kind of heavy language. A contaminated thing just means that it has past karma and delusion as its origin. So a less kind of loaded term for contaminated thing is ordinary thing, right? It's not an enlightened thing. It's not enlightened mind. It's not enlightened form. It's not enlightened environment. It's ordinary, because it arose due to past karma mixed with affliction, or delusion here it says. So our bodies, for example, are ordinary, or here contaminated, right? Because we are not enlightened. So we have a form that exists in dependence upon past karma and mixed with delusion. If we didn't have past karma mixed with delusion, we would be an enlightened being. We wouldn't have given rise to take this form. But we are ordinary, so we have an ordinary form. Everything in our world is the product of a whole bunch of ordinary forms. So everything in our world is also here contaminated or ordinary, because it is the product of ordinary mind, ordinary body, ordinary kind of arising. So I just think, for me, ordinary is a less kind of loaded phrase than contaminated, because all that it really means is that the reason that it has come into being is due to, in the past, it's connected to karma mixed with delusion. And there's going to be a good amount of explication on the idea of karma a bit, later as we go through the course. So basically, again, everything that we interact with on the earth is an ordinary thing, is a contaminated thing. And as such, it lacks the ability to cause any kind of real, genuine happiness or contentment. It lacks that power because it's ordinary. There's nothing that we can eat or drink or listen to or do that itself has past karma and delusion as its origin, that has the power to make us really, genuinely, truly happy. We looked at that second aspect of the truth of suffering, which is changeable suffering, right? All ordinary things are in the nature of changeable suffering. They're not in the nature of true happiness. Okay. Okay, so I said I would pause. Any thoughts or questions on anything that we've covered so far, these first two seals, or? Nope. All right. Okay, so the third seal is here. This one we're going to kind of have to put a pin in because it's introducing a very complicated topic. And so we're going to really have to come back to this again, really sort of again in the last class where we're going to cover this idea of selflessness in the fifth class. But essentially, the shortest way of describing this quickly without going into any real detail is if we go back to the Buddhist model of the mind when I was talking about how there's bare sensory data and then there's mental activity, the mental sense power that's coming along behind it. And I said how the sensory data isn't containing any information about whether something is pleasant or unpleasant. That's happening in the mind. And so that coming along behind and giving that kind of, in a way, that essence, right? We look at a painting and we don't just say, well, yeah, there's some colors, there's some lines. It's meant to represent a person, or it's meant to represent, we have this experience of it. We say, well, that's a really attractive, I want to purchase that painting. Seeing that makes me happy. I enjoy looking at it. I'm going to pay someone money so that I can take it home, I can put it on my wall, I can see it every day. Because by looking at it, I feel a sense of pleasantness that arises. We think that the reason that we experience that pleasantness is because it's a pleasant object. It is separate from me, it is out there, and it is a pleasant object, and I have stumbled upon it, and it is because it is a pleasant object, my being in contact with it will make me experience pleasure, or like with chocolate, or what have you. We think that chocolate is in the nature of pleasure. And so if I'm not having a great time, if I interact with this thing that's outside of myself, that's in the nature of pleasure, I will begin to have a better time, right? Because it is in the nature of pleasure, I'm associating myself with it, I'm bringing it into my experience. Therefore, necessarily, I will begin to have a better time than I was before. And what we misunderstand is that it is our mind that is layering on top of the raw sensory data that our eye consciousness, our ear consciousness, our tongue consciousness, all of these bodily senses are bringing into the mind. It's layering on top a determination of pleasant or unpleasant, or kind of neutral, kind of boring, kind of I could take it, I could leave it. That's happening in the mind. So we're actively layering on top of external reality these judgments about reality, but we don't take responsibility for what's happening in the mind. We think that we've just noticed that which is pleasant or unpleasant outside of myself, and hey, I like pleasant things and I don't like pleasant things, so I need to collect all of the pleasant things and I need to separate myself from all of the unpleasant things, and then I will be happy. Then I will have done, what I can do to positively influence my mind in the best possible way. So we imbue all phenomena with this, what here would be the opposite of selfless, with like a self, a status, a nature, an essence. And that's only actually coming from the mind. It's actively being layered on top of these objects. And they don't exist that way. They don't have that status. The chocolate is not pleasant from its own side. Asparagus is not unpleasant from its own side. What have you. We, through our culture, through our experiences, through our family life, our previous habituations, we've come to arrive at certain preferences, certain views about things. And we impose those views, those preferences on sensory data, and then we don't take any responsibility for how active that is. And so we give phenomena a status that phenomena lack. So if someone says that things do have that status, then that's not a Buddhist teaching, because the Buddha is saying, well, no, that perception of a status, that perception of an essence is not there in the object, it's only there in the mind. But we're going to unpack that in more detail in the last class, because it's one of the most important concepts in Buddhist philosophy. Similarly, if people say, that there is real happiness to be found, in sensory, pleasures, what have you, then that would go against the second seal. All contaminated things are not satisfactory. If someone say, well, if you just enjoy your life, if you just pursue sensory pleasure, that's the best, or that's the highest form of contentment, that wouldn't be true from the Buddhist perspective. You would say they're not teaching you a Buddhist idea, which is fine, but it's important to know how to distinguish. And then the fourth seal is nirvana, is peace. So we talked again about these two cessations, the lower nirvana, higher nirvana, individual enlightenment, full enlightenment. These are both cessations. And as cessations, they are, what are they cessations of? They are cessations of afflictions, cessations of delusions, cessations of the states of mind that cause us to suffer. They are two paths, both taught by the Buddha. They're both valid and true cessations. And so they're described as the ultimate peace, the ultimate happiness, bliss, contentment, peace, but only those two cessations. Anything other than those two cessations is not true peace. It might be comparatively more peaceful than something else, but it isn't a true cessation, and therefore it's not true peace. So if someone says, well, you just have to be ethical, or you just have to do kind of like what this religious system kind of says you should do, then you'll be rewarded and you'll have this perfect, eternal peace from that. Well, that's not nirvana, right? That's not a true cessation of affliction, just by being polite and kind and generous and so on. And that'll become more clear when we look at, again, this idea of the nature of reality, and that's sort of in the fifth class. So, but again, that just means it's a non-Buddhist philosophy, which is fine, totally valid for there to be non-Buddhist philosophies or religions, but that just means that it's something other than what the Buddha taught. Okay, so that's one way of talking about what it means to be Buddhist, that the teachings abide or are in accordance with the four seals. Now we have a different way of understanding this concept, which is the 5 lay precepts. So if a person becomes Buddhist, then they are agreeing to adopt a training that is called the 5 lay vows, the 5 lay precepts, the 5 training precepts. This is related to the ethical teachings of the Buddha. So if a person doesn't abide by these 5 lay precepts, then they're not living in accordance with the ethical teachings of the Buddha. and so they wouldn't validly be, really Buddhist. And again, that's totally fine. A person can adopt aspects of Buddhism that they find benefits their life, or maybe just certain meditative practices, totally fine. But when a person becomes Buddhist, then the training in the 5 lay vows becomes an important part of their life going forward. So we'll talk about these. Okay. So this is, sorry. Oh, I should fix myself. Let's see here. Give me 1 second. That's better. Okay, so this isn't specifically about any one precept, but this is kind of talking about why the Buddha gave, the precepts. Because the 5 lay, as I said, it's connected to the ethical teachings of the Buddha, but it's not the totality of the ethical teachings of the Buddha, these 5 lay precepts. The idea behind the 5 lay precepts is that they are coarser aspects of the ethical teachings, meaning that it's reasonable, as it kind of says here, it's reasonable to adopt these 5 trainings for the rest of a person's life. So essentially, a person is saying, I will do my best to never engage in these 5 negative actions for the rest of my life. We might make a mistake, here and there, and, but we're going to do our best. So, for example, one of the 5 lay precepts is not to never raise our voice in anger, right? Because that would be too subtle. That would be too difficult to say, I'm confident that for the next 40 years, I will never raise my voice in anger. The Buddha talks about harsh speech as part of his ethical teachings, and we'll get to that. But the 5 lay precepts are coarser than that because, as I say, this person, this Buddhist, is saying, well, for the rest of my life, because it's a coarser action, I can actually say, I will abstain from doing this, forever. Okay, so the first precept is do not kill. So here, as you can see, there are 2 ways in which this is intended. We can kill a human being, or we can kill a non-human animal. And we talked about the distinction last week between the fact that the experiences that humans and animals are having are very different. So Buddhism distinguishes between them. Buddhism says that a cow is an animal and a human is not an animal. A human is a human because of the very, very different experiences that humans and animals are having. So the vow applies to both humans and animals. It isn't to say that when we take the vow only applies to killing humans. That's not true. The vow applies to killing any sentient being. However, on a practical level, I think one of the reasons why they make a distinction is that on a practical level, it is a lot more difficult to go for the next 40 years without killing a mosquito or a fly or a cockroach or something like that. That's quite challenging. Now, the vow says that we should really make an effort, even to not kill a mosquito, to not kill a fly, to not kill a cockroach. But as you can see here, if we do that, it damages the vow. It doesn't destroy the vow. If we take the life of a human, that does destroy the vow, and we have to actually retake the vow. The idea is that we can't say that we're holding that vow any longer if they call this destroying it from the root, meaning that in the continuity of our mind, we disregarded it so seriously, so dramatically, that we can't say that I'm actually upholding it. We would have to go back to, generally a person takes the 5 lay precepts from a teacher in a ceremony, and they would have to go back to that teacher or a different teacher, kind of explain what happened. Hopefully it was, kind of like a life or death situation where they really felt like they didn't have much of a choice. Hopefully it was something like that, and it wasn't premeditated, or it wasn't, that would be, of course, much worse. But you would have to actually retake the vow. But if you do kill, a fly, you don't have to retake the vow, even though, again, we're exhorted to really make an effort in both cases. And again, this is just kind of explaining why, or to give more of a scriptural citation for the vow itself. And again, this is just giving you a little bit more of the kind of the advantages. So we become someone, as it says here, we become someone who isn't a danger to sentient beings. By abiding in this vow, we're no longer a danger to sentient beings. And sentient beings are safe with us. We become safe for sentient beings, which is, in line with our spiritual aspirations, our spiritual goals. Okay. So then the second precept is to not steal, and I'll pause again for questions after we cover the second precept. So do not steal. So stealing in this context has a specific definition, and it means to not take anything that's not been freely given by the owner of whatever it is. And this is a stricter definition than we may have used in our lives prior to the point where we took this vow from a teacher, and that's fine. We may previously, if we saw, a $20 bill on the street and there was nobody around, it was dark, it was night, we maybe just kind of took that $20 bill and put it in our pocket and said, well, I don't know whose it is, nobody's around, I couldn't possibly find whoever it is, so, I'm just going to appropriate it, I'm going to take it for myself. That's stealing according to this way of understanding it, because someone dropped that $20 bill, it belonged to someone, and they didn't hand it to us and say, here, please have this. This is mine. I'm giving it to you. Please enjoy my $20 bill, right? So if we just take something that we know doesn't belong to us, we know that it, at some point, didn't belong to us, and we're just saying, well, this is mine now. That, from this perspective, becomes stealing. So we're agreeing for the rest of our lives to uphold this understanding of stealing, even if we had a looser definition before. So anything that we know isn't ours, we should just never appropriate. Of course, we can't, with all of these, to some degree or another, we do have to use our judgment. We do have to use our own. We're not completely abandoning our own wisdom, our own judgment, our own sense of what is best in a given situation. For example, a person's car keys. don't belong to us, right? Those car keys, they belong to someone else. But if that person's intoxicated, we may feel the need to appropriate those car keys because our motivation is to protect their life and the lives of other people that they might take if they were to drive under the influence. So technically, you're kind of, they don't want you to take their car. They're pretty upset with you. Technically, and you could say it's sort of stealing, but there might be a higher motivation that's behind that that would really justify what you're doing. So what that is getting at too is that these 5 precepts, they're not moralistic. They're not a kind of black and white moralistic description. Really, and we'll talk about this too in relation to karma, what the Buddha observed, because again, everything that the Buddha taught was just his own just his own direct observation, right? So what he observed is that there were a number of behaviors, actions, which you could take for the arising of a negative mental state. That typically they were caused by the arising of a negative mental state. So typically, when, if a person breaks into so-and-so's house and takes something off of their wall and brings it back to their house, that's because they have a lot of jealousy in the mind, a lot of greed in the mind, a lot of envy in the mind. They have a callous disregard for the property, the rights of others. And those are all really negative states of mind. They were not overwhelmed by loving kindness or compassion or generosity or patience or, that's not what was happening in their mind. So generally speaking, when we are motivated to take the life of another sentient being, or here, when we're motivated to take the property of another sentient being, it is because there is a negative mental state present in the mind. And it's that negative mental state that the Buddha is worried about. That's what he cares about. That is what is causing us to suffer in that moment. And the more habitual those negative mental states become, the more deeply ingrained those habits become, the more likely we are to engage in those unskillful actions in the future, the more and more we're going to suffer, and the more and more suffering we're going to visit upon others. So it isn't that so that's why we have to really analyze it. It isn't, like I say, it's not moralistic, it's not black and white. We actually have to analyze, is a negative mental state arising in my mind? Is that what is motivating my action or not? So when we take someone's car keys because they're intoxicated, there's no, we're going to give them back. We're not going to actually just steal their car. And we don't want their car. We're not trying to be deceitful. We're just trying to protect their lives and the lives of others. So technically it's stealing, maybe, but we probably should do it because there isn't actually a negative mental state arising in our mind. But when we see the $5 bill, kind of on the floor, and we're like, oh, that would be cool if I got to spend that, even though I know that somebody else worked hard for that and it really is theirs, that is a negative mental state. That's greed. That's arising in our mind. So we should abstain from giving in to actions that are motivated by these negative mental states. And the Buddha is just saying we can use certain actions as proxies or as stand-ins for these negative mental states. Okay. So this is talking about how it is the mental state. So we have this thievish intent, right? We know it's not ours. We want to appropriate it. We want to be able to use it. We want to be able to take advantage of it. So, yeah, so we know what we're doing and we do it anyway because we just want to be able to use whatever it is that belongs to the other person. Okay, I will pause again. Any thoughts or questions about the first two training precepts, first two lay vows?
I have a question. So the first one, I mean, I'm just wondering like if an animal, is killed because I'm thinking like if we eat, chicken or meat or something like that. That's one of my first questions. What would that fall under? Or is that something we should maybe not do? Or if we continuously do that, then that is like, because I know you're saying that it's not, it's more damaging, but I'm wondering if you continuously do it, then is it different? It's more, I guess, it's stronger than just damaging. So that's my first question about that. And then my other is the second one of killing a human. And I know you're saying there's different circumstances, but just a thought of like if you got in a car accident and someone died, I mean, just as an example, then would you have to, again, have your vows redone? Those are just a couple of questions, just as examples.
Yep. So with both of those examples, the teaching on intent, comes up, right? Because with the first example of not directly, like indirectly participating in a system where sentient beings are going to be killed because of what a person purchases or doesn't purchase, there's effects of that. From the Buddhist, because this is related to karma, and because karma isn't moralistic and it's not moral teachings, that kind of thing, that talks about rights and responsibilities and that kind of, and Buddhism isn't really talking about that. Buddhism is really talking about what is the state of mind that is actually there when an action is engaged in. So for the karma of killing to attach in the mind, the person actually has to, and again, we'll look at this in more detail when there'll be a bit of a section on karma, but the person has to observe a living sentient being. They have to wish to bring about the death of that sentient being, and then they have to engage in an action that brings about the death of that sentient being. Now, there is a person now with, as you said, with regard to choosing, to eat an animal product or something, there is someone that is involved in that process, right? That animal's not killing itself. Someone you're participating in a system where there is a person doing that kind of on your behalf in a way. But it seems clear that the karma of killing only attaches for the person who's actually taking that life. They're probably not Buddhist, they probably haven't taken a vow not to kill, but still, killing is what's called a naturally negative action. So there is a negative karma that they are accumulating because of, even though maybe they feel like I have to do it for my job, I don't have a lot of job options, this is I'm kind of stuck. Those maybe, that's better than like, I really look forward to going to work every day and doing this. Like that would be worse, right? If they really enjoyed it, which, I mean, they don't, like if you study, it's a really awful kind of job to have. And there's a lot of mental health issues that arise from that. It's really pretty terrible for those workers. And they're a lot of times they're, undocumented immigrants, and they're in very, very dire straits economically. But still, because they are doing that, there is a negative karma that's attaching because they're observing sentient beings that are alive. They're intentionally, they understand that they're bringing about the death of that sentient being and so on. Now, there is a sutra called the Lankavatara Sutra, where, and there's a chapter in the Lankavatara Sutra called On Eating Meat. And the Buddha does give in the Lankavatara Sutra a lot of reasons why he encourages people not to engage in that kind of action. But it's never linked to the karma of killing. So we do have to be precise about, is it the karma of killing or is it not the karma of killing? But in the Lankavatara Sutra, so if, to your question, like what should we do? If you read the Lankavatara Sutra and you take the Lankavatara Sutra seriously, the Buddha is telling you what to do, in that sutra. He's giving a lot of very detailed reasons why it's best to avoid even that participation in that system, as you're saying. So then in the second, in terms of like accidentally, again, that goes back to intent. If we didn't see someone, we're driving, they kind of pull out in front of us, what have you. Again, we never had the intent to take their lives. So again, it's not the karma of killing. Now, if we're driving recklessly, if we're, we're engaging in dangerous behaviors, it's still not the karma of killing because we didn't have any animosity toward that person. We didn't say, oh, I hope that I take their life. But that becomes much more negative because we weren't conducting ourselves in a safe, responsible way, which is different than like, I couldn't have avoided it. They came out of nowhere, that kind of thing. So we would bear some karmic responsibility if we were really being, if we were speeding or if we were really just being reckless or uncaring about others. But still not really. But if someone breaks into our house and we shoot them, then, of course, we didn't wake up that day hoping to kill anyone. We didn't go out of our way. But even in that moment, we said, my life is more important than their life. Even if they were going to take my life, we said my life is more important than their life. And that's not perfectly amazing karma. Like it's a little bit problematic. It's not ideal. So we can't say that that's a completely non-negative action. It's much less negative than going out and killing out of malice or killing out. That's much heavier, much more intense karma. So these things, they exist in gradations. They exist on a scale, depending on how strong our intent is, how diluted our intent is. But there is basically, because killing is a naturally negative action, there's no way, essentially for an ordinary sentient being, there's really no way to take the life of another sentient being without it being negative, at least a little bit, in some degree. We can't say that no negative karma attaches.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Yeah, so it's about the intention. And then also, like you were saying, it's analyzing it really kind of. So yeah, okay, that makes sense. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Okay, so the third precept is to not commit sexual misconduct. There's two types of sexual misconduct. There's adultery, and then there's non-consensual sexual behaviors. Adultery, we often, because it's an English word, and we think of it as being related to like a marriage. And in the Buddhist context, it doesn't have to be. It does apply to an intimate relationship that two people are in, but they don't have to be legally married. As it says here, there just has to be a realistic expectation of monogamy between two people, right? If there's two people and they're in a relationship and that expectation is validly there and there was a discussion, they agreed upon it, then anything that that person does to violate that expectation is sexual misconduct. So again, these are lay precepts, because of course monks and nuns are celibate. So these are the 5 lay vows. They don't apply to people who are taking a vow of celibacy. That's different. But if you're a lay Buddhist, you're certainly free to get married, to date, what have you. And if and when you're in that kind of relationship, you shouldn't violate that expectation of monogamy. And then, of course, there's non-consensual sexual behavior. So this would be any kind of unwanted, undesired, unwished for, kind of aggressive, violent, that sort of sexual behavior would also be sexual misconduct. So adultery, that other person might be fully, consenting, but the person who's not consenting is the person that you're cheating on, right? They are harmed by that. So you're harming people in one of 2 ways. You're harming either your partner, or you're directly harming the person that you're engaging in this behavior with because they don't want it. So if you're a layperson and you've taken these vows, you have to be really mindful of not violating any monogamy, and also not engaging in anything that would be non-consensual, anything that the other person wouldn't want you to be doing. And again, this is of course on a spectrum. There's like touching, and and then all the way up, of course, to a fully consecrated act. So again, it would be on a spectrum with regard to both of these. There's more or less intense ways of breaking this precept, but you would want to try to not break it at all, would be good. Sorry. So then the 4th precept is to not lie. So to lie, as it says, is to say something that you know to be untrue to another sentient being who can understand you, and then subsequently, they are deceived by what you have said. So here we're talking about intentional deception, being intentionally misleading, saying something that, so if you yourself are confused, if you yourself, are mistaken about the nature of something, then you haven't lied if you repeat that to the other person. But if you know that what you're saying is not the truth, and you want the other person to believe something that's not the truth, and again, usually we do this because we want to get something from that other person. We want to manipulate them. We know that if they knew the truth, they wouldn't do what we wanted. They wouldn't act how we wanted them to act. But we think that if they don't know the truth, if they know something that's a lie, then they will respond how we want them to respond. They'll be willing to, we might say, oh, I need this money because my house burned down, and your house didn't burn down. But if you tell them, well, I just have a gambling debt, they're not going to give you money, right? So you manipulate them. You want them to do something for you, and you have to give them a false understanding of what's true in order to get them to do that. So generally, being deceitful is very manipulative. It's generally, we're trying to get people to do things, and we have to lie in order for that to happen. And again, here, we also, once again, have to really use our wisdom, because we don't want to tell the truth if some great harm will result from telling the truth. For example, we might, again, be protecting someone from someone else. If we know that someone's in danger from someone who's abusive, that person might be in hiding. We might know where that person is hiding, and we really shouldn't tell the person who's trying to find them where they can find them, right? So we would need to lie. We would need to not tell them the truth in order to protect that person's life. So again, we should never have kind of a slavish deference to these precepts if it's clear that by following them, a much greater harm is going to befall someone, or if we're clear in our own mind that there's no negativity, that we're not being manipulative for our own benefit. Our goal, our intent is to protect someone's life. or to protect their well-being or what have you. So these are just things to kind of wrestle with and things to really think about, but they're not like, oh, well, the Buddha said I can't lie. So yeah, here's where that person that you're going to go and kill is, have a good time. Like that would be terrible. You shouldn't do that. So we really have to be skillful when we're trying to work with these precepts. Okay, and the fifth precept is to not take intoxicants. So here, the definition of an intoxicant is given. An intoxicant is any substance that leads to what they call heedlessness that doesn't have any kind of medicinal purpose. So we know, of course, that painkillers and different things, they might alter, it says don't operate heavy machinery and so on, because we know we're going to be altered when we take it. We might even be disinhibited in various ways. We might not be fully in touch with our faculties when we're under the influence of something that our doctor gives. So if it has a medicinal purpose, then even if it leads to some kind of heedlessness, it's okay, because we're doing it because we're actually suffering, we're actually ill, we're actually in pain. So again, this is something for oneself to judge for oneself. Is it true that I have some kind of condition? Is it true that I'm suffering in some way? I have pain, I have nausea, I have, I'm undergoing cancer treatment, whatever it is that true? And is my goal to just be returned to like a normal level of functioning with the least amount of side effects? If that's true, then whatever it is fine. It's not an intoxicant. But if I'm just trying to, if my goal is heedlessness, if my goal is to just not be in touch with reality, to just get drunk or get high because I want to experience that altered state, then it is an intoxicant. And really what the Buddha is concerned about here is that when we are in that altered state, when we're not really in touch with what's going on around us, which is what heedlessness is, then we can't maintain any awareness of our vows, of what ethics is, what appropriate conduct is. We've all had that experience, right? I mean, we've all woken up and been like, what did I do last night? And you have to call people and you have to hope you didn't do anything really embarrassing. And we've all been in that heedlessness state, right? And that's what the Buddha is concerned about. It's like, what are the kinds of mistakes that can arise when we are in that state of mind, when we're not really clear about who's in front of us, what's happening, because our mind is just altered. Our mind is not really able to discern with wisdom what's going on around us. So he's concerned about, the decisions, the poor decisions that we've all made more than once when we experimented with these sorts of intoxicants. And he's saying, it's better to really retain control of your faculties, to be clear-headed, to be able to respond appropriately to your surroundings and to what is happening before you. Because it's much easier to give in to anger, to give in to jealousy, to be really impulsive, to not act in alignment with our higher selves when we're under the influence of these intoxicants. So with regard to this, the strictest way of applying this is, as it says, to just really never, to just avoid it completely. That's a very strict way of upholding this vow. Now, it is to some degree an individual for a layperson. To some degree, it can be an individual decision. If heedlessness is the real problem, then is a single drink for example, is that going to lead me down, to heedlessness? If a person doesn't have a problem with alcohol, if they, now some people do have a problem with alcohol. If they're going to have one drink, then they might spiral. And that for that person, they would have to be really, much more considerate. Other people are like, yeah, I can have a champagne toast. I can, maybe I can have a glass of wine. And I'm not going to give in to heedlessness. I'm just going to have the one, and then I'm going to be done. So, to some degree, there's a choice that people can make about how they think about this. I always say that I do think it's important or useful because a person is taking these precepts with a teacher in a ceremony. I do think it's helpful to have a sense of what that person intends. What does your teacher, how does your teacher intend for people to hold this vow? Is it their intent that people who are holding this vow hold it in that really strict way, like you just really completely avoid, or do they have a little bit of flexibility? Because it's not great to take a vow from your teacher and then not uphold it in the way that they sort of anticipated that it would be upheld. I have heard that when like the Dalai Lama has given refuge vows to like stadiums full of people, he has sort of said, well, okay, if you want to have a drink with dinner, like, okay. But I know that like the first time I took, refuge vows, it seemed to me that my teacher was pretty clearly saying, like, my expectation is that really you got to just avoid it. It's really, there's just no reason to go down this path at all, because then it kind of becomes a crutch, or it kind of becomes like, this is how I unwind. This is how, rather than turning toward our practice and using that, we're kind of like, well, I'm going to look forward to this all day, and I'm going to, it's going to kind of be a focal point. And that's not so great. When we have alternatives, like we can, find that same kind of relief if we turn toward our practice, if we turn toward meditation and so on, really cultivating, because again, we're externalizing, we're thinking that this substance, this thing outside of ourselves is what's going to bring about some kind of peace of mind, and that's false. That's that is a mistaken view. That way of thinking is wrong. It is not correct. It is not true. How harmful that way of thinking is, but it's also not true when we have dessert, right? When we also have the ice cream, or we're wrong about that too. And there's no vow about not having ice cream. So, you can kind of think about, well, what is the result? How negative is the result? And you can, maybe something to think about and make a decision about for yourself. But it is a vow, this is a precept to avoid intoxicants. Okay. So that is, yeah, so this is again, talking about why what is the point of the 5 lay vows? The point of the 5 lay vows is that all of these negative actions are caused by negative states of mind, and they are related to suffering. So by killing, by stealing, by lying, by engaging in sexual misconduct, by taking intoxicants or abusing intoxicants, we are creating a pattern of our own suffering. And as long as we think that that's okay, we will continue to suffer. We will continue to experience suffering. So these negative actions are, they're binding us. They're binding us to cyclic existence. They are creating the causes and the conditions of our suffering. And the Buddha's really, he's just saying, like, this is how, this is, by training in ethics, we can, make progress in the right direction. He's not trying to take away all of our fun. He's saying it's not fun. It's actually creating the causes of suffering. It's sowing the seeds of your own suffering. Okay, so that's all I had for today. Are there any questions, thoughts, or questions from anything we've covered today or last week that anybody would like to ask a question about? Nope. All right. So Geshe Sopa is teaching tomorrow on refuge. So he's teaching tomorrow and next week on refuge. So he's teaching, unfortunately, he has taught at the center, but he's teaching for us, unfortunately, only on Zoom. But fortunately, we're getting teachings, and he's exceptional. So if you were interested in learning more about refuge, that's happening tomorrow night and next Wednesday as well. All right, so I hope to see everyone. Yes, Sorry, you're muted.
Um,
Yep, there you go.
okay. I guess I don't know what you mean by the word refuge. I don't know if I missed that in the.
Oh, sorry. No, that's my fault. So the ceremony in which a person takes the five lay vows is called going for refuge.
Oh,
It's called the refuge ceremony, where a person is becoming Buddhist. A person who becomes Buddhist is a person who understands that the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners who have understood his teachings, that they are the most valid sources of refuge, and they go to the Buddha, to the Dharma, to the Sangha for refuge, and then they take the five lay vows.
thank you.
Okay. All right, so we'll pick it back up next week with class 3.